Margaret's confidence flickered for just a moment. That's not how inspections work. Actually, it is? If you're claiming legal authority to inspect my property and potentially fine me based on what you find, I have the right to know who's conducting the inspection and what standards they're applying. Jennifer Walsh spoke up for the first time. Mr. Johnson, I'm a certified property assessment specialist. We're simply here to evaluate compliance with community architectural standards. Great. Let me see your certification. The request clearly caught her off guard. She glanced at Margaret, then back at me, then started fumbling through her purse. I don't carry the physical certificate with me, but I can provide references. And what about you? I asked David Kim. I'm an HO, a compliance specialist, he said, but his voice carried the uncertain tone of someone who wasn't quite sure what that meant. Certified by whom? Another exchange of glances. David looked at Margaret, who had gone from smug confidence to barely controlled irritation in the span of about 30 seconds. Mr. Johnson, Margaret said, you're being deliberately obstructive. We have legal authority here, and your continued resistance is only going to make this process more expensive and unpleasant for everyone involved. That's when I realized what was really happening. Margaret had hired what appeared to be a couple of freelance contractors to create the impression of professional, official oversight. She was essentially staging an elaborate theatrical performance designed to intimidate me into submission. But she'd made a critical error. She'd brought her performance to my doorstep, where I had home field advantage and the ability to control the terms of engagement. You know what? I said, stepping aside and gesturing them into my house. Come on in. Let's get this inspection started. Margaret looked surprised but pleased. Jennifer and David followed her through my front door, both of them immediately pulling out their equipment and starting to document everything they saw. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent the past week preparing for exactly this scenario. I guided them through my house slowly, answering their questions politely, and watching as they photographed, measured, and documented every minor imperfection they could find. Margaret was clearly delighted with the process, pointing out what she claimed were violations: paint that was allegedly the wrong shade of beige, window trim that was supposedly non-compliant with architectural standards, and interior decorating choices that she insisted detracted from community cohesion. The inspection lasted 2 hours. By the end, Jennifer had taken 127 photographs, and David had compiled a list of 23 alleged violations ranging from non-standard doorknob finishes to excessive indoor plant display. Thank you for your cooperation, Margaret said as they prepared to leave. You'll receive a full compliance report within 5 business days, along with a timeline for correcting the identified violations. Actually, I said, before you go, I have something for you. I handed Margaret a thick manila envelope that I'd prepared the night before. Her name was written on the front in block letters, and the back was sealed with tape that had my signature written across it, a little trick I'd learned to ensure that documents couldn't be opened and resealed without leaving evidence. What's this? She asked. Your copy of the official complaint I filed yesterday with the State Attorney General's office regarding unauthorized HOA activities, fraudulent representation of legal authority, and potential violations of the Texas Property Code. Margaret's face went completely white. Jennifer and David both stopped walking and turned to stare at her. I also filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau regarding your consultants here, the City Attorney's Office regarding misuse of official-sounding documents, and the County Clerk regarding improper HOA governance procedures. I could see Margaret's hands starting to shake as she held the envelope. But the most interesting thing I discovered during my research this week was that you never actually filed the proper paperwork to update our HOA's governing documents, which means every rule change you've made, every fine you've issued, and every threat you've delivered has been completely illegal. Margaret dropped the envelope. Papers scattered across my front porch, and I could see David Kim backing toward the street, like he was trying to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. "That's impossible," Margaret said, but her voice had lost all of its authority and confidence. "I followed all the procedures." "No, Margaret. You followed the procedures you made up. The actual procedures require state filing, homeowner notification, and legal review. None of which you did. I had one more card to play, and this was the moment to use it. Oh, and Margaret, tomorrow night, I'm hosting a little gathering in my backyard. Just a small celebration of successfully defending my property rights against HOA overreach. There'll be a campfire, of course, and maybe some friends, and possibly some live music." The look of dawning horror on Margaret's face told me she understood exactly what I was planning. "You wouldn't." "I absolutely would. And thanks to your little inspection theater today, I now have legal documentation that you've been operating outside your authority, which means I have grounds for a restraining order if you try to interfere." Margaret gathered up her scattered papers, grabbed Jennifer and David, and practically ran to their car. But as they drove away, I could see her on her phone, gesturing frantically as she spoke to someone. I had won this battle, but I realized that Margaret wasn't the type to simply accept defeat and move on. She was going to escalate again, and this time, she was going to bring everything she had. What I didn't know was that everything she had included connections I hadn't anticipated, resources I hadn't accounted for, and a willingness to cross lines that even I hadn't imagined. The war was just getting started. The calm before the storm. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear autumn weather that makes you grateful to be alive. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and I was planning the most epic neighborhood gathering in Willowbrook Estates history. But first, I had calls to make. I started with my cousin Jake, who ran a small event planning business and had connections throughout the local entertainment industry. "You want to throw a what?" Jake asked when I explained my situation. "A neighborhood appreciation party, with live music, food trucks, and maybe some fireworks. Nothing too crazy, just enough to celebrate successfully defending property rights against HOA tyranny." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he started laughing. "Dude, you realize this could get seriously expensive, right? And depending on how big you want to go, you might need city permits, sound ordinances, insurance." "Jake, what would it take to throw a legitimate, fully legal, properly permitted party that happens to be loud enough for the entire neighborhood to enjoy?" Another pause. "How loud are we talking about?" I looked out my back window toward Margaret's house, where I could see her pacing back and forth in her kitchen, still on the phone with whoever she'd been calling for the past 18 hours. Loud enough that someone 3 houses away would have trouble sleeping through it. "Oh," Jake said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Oh, this is going to be good." We spent the next hour planning what Jake called the most legally compliant act of petty revenge he'd ever been asked to organize. The beauty of it was that everything we were planning was not only legal, but actively supported by city ordinances designed to promote community events and neighborhood engagement. By noon, I had permits filed for a community appreciation gathering, featuring live music, temporary food vendors, and a small fireworks display to celebrate neighborhood unity and property rights awareness. The permits were expedited because my event qualified as a community service activity that promoted civic engagement. The fireworks permit was particularly satisfying to obtain. As it turned out, Texas has very liberal laws regarding private fireworks displays, and my party fell well within the guidelines for residential celebrations. All I needed was insurance, which Jake's company provided, proper safety clearances, which my large backyard easily met, and notification to adjacent property owners, which I would be providing very soon. By Saturday afternoon, Jake had lined up a bluegrass band, a food truck specializing in barbecue, a local brewery that was excited to sponsor a property rights awareness event, and a pyrotechnics company that promised a modest but memorable fireworks display. The total cost was going to be about $3,000, which seemed like a reasonable price for the most satisfying evening of my life. But as I was finalizing the details, I noticed something that made me pause. Margaret's house had been unusually quiet all day, and her car had been gone since early morning. The curtains were drawn, and there were no signs of the frantic activity I'd expected after yesterday's confrontation. That should have been my first warning that Margaret was planning something much bigger than I'd anticipated. The second warning came at 4 p.m. when Bob Martinez called me with news that made my blood run cold. "She's hired a lawyer," Bob said without preamble. "Margaret retained the firm that handles legal action for the fancy hoes across town. Word is, she's planning to file for an emergency injunction to stop your party." "On what grounds?" "Nuisance, property damage, violation of community standards. Basically, she's throwing every possible legal theory at the wall and hoping something sticks." I felt my stomach drop. An injunction could shut down my party before it started. And even if I eventually won the legal battle, the victory would be meaningless if Margaret succeeded in stopping the actual event. "But here's the thing," Bob continued. "Her lawyer is expensive, and she's been talking around the neighborhood about creating a legal defense fund to protect the community from disruptive elements. She's actually asking neighbors to contribute money to pay for her lawsuit against you." The audacity was breathtaking, but it also revealed something important about Margaret's strategy. She wasn't just fighting me, she was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me by framing this as a community defense issue rather than what it really was, a power-drunk HOA president abusing her position to settle personal vendettas. "Bob, how many people have contributed to her fund?" "As far as I can tell, 2. Her boyfriend and one other neighbor who's afraid of getting on her bad side." "But she's telling people that she has overwhelming community support for stopping your dangerous and disruptive activities." That gave me an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Bob, what if instead of fighting Margaret's legal strategy, we embraced it?" "What do you mean?" "What if we let her file for an injunction, and then we use the legal proceedings to expose everything she's been doing? All the illegal rule changes, the fake authority, the harassment, everything becomes part of the public record." Bob was quiet for a long moment. "That's actually not a terrible idea. But it's risky. If she wins the injunction, your party is done. Then we'd better make sure she doesn't win." I spent the rest of Saturday afternoon preparing for legal warfare while simultaneously finalizing party preparations. The juxtaposition was surreal. I was ordering kegs and researching case law, confirming fireworks permits, and drafting legal briefs. By Sunday morning, I had everything in place for what would either be the most spectacular neighborhood party in history or the most expensive legal mistake of my life. But as I was reviewing my final preparations, I noticed something that made me realize Margaret had been planning her own surprise. There were cars I didn't recognize parked on the street around my house. Not many, just 3 or 4, but they'd been there since early morning, and the people inside seemed to be watching my house rather than visiting neighbors. Margaret hadn't just hired a lawyer, she'd hired investigators. The woman who'd started this entire conflict by complaining about my campfire was now running surveillance on my property in preparation for a legal battle over my right to have a party in my own backyard. As I watched one of the cars slowly circle the block for the 3rd time in an hour, I realized that my little neighborhood drama had just escalated into something much larger and more serious than I'd ever intended. But Margaret had made one critical error in her escalation strategy. She'd given me advance warning of exactly how far she was willing to go. and that meant I could prepare accordingly. The final gambit, community support. Sunday afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 8 years of living in Willowbrook Estates. I went door to door to talk to my neighbors. Not about Margaret's legal threats, or the surveillance cars, or the injunction she was planning to file. Instead, I talked to them about community, about the kind of neighborhood we wanted to live in, and about what was really at stake in this fight. My first stop was the Johnson family, who lived 2 houses down and had received one of Margaret's violation notices for their vegetable garden. "Mr. Johnson," I said, "I wanted to let you know that I'm throwing a community appreciation party next Saturday evening, and you and your family are invited." Mrs. Johnson's face lit up immediately. "Oh, that sounds wonderful. We haven't had a neighborhood gathering in years." "I also wanted you to know that Margaret Henderson has been threatening legal action to stop the party, and I think it's important that everyone understands what's really happening here." I spent 15 minutes explaining Margaret's pattern of harassment, her illegal rule changes, and her systematic campaign to transform our neighborhood according to her personal vision. The Johnsons listened with growing alarm and anger. "She can't actually foreclose on our houses, can she?" Mr. Johnson asked. "Not legally, no. But she can make your life miserable with fake fines and harassment until you either fight back or give in to her demands." By the time I left, both Johnsons had committed to attending my party and to supporting any legal challenges to Margaret's authority. My next stop was the Patel family, who'd been cited for their wind chimes. Then the Rodriguez family, who'd been threatened over their excessive vehicle storage. Then the elderly Henderson couple, no relation to Margaret, who'd been told their lawn gnomes violated architectural standards. At each house, I found the same thing: neighbors who were frustrated, confused, and angry about Margaret's increasingly aggressive enforcement of rules that seemed to change daily according to her personal preferences. People who'd been afraid to speak up individually but were eager to support collective resistance. By evening, I had commitments from 12 families to attend my party and to stand together against Margaret's legal threats. More importantly, I had their stories documented accounts of Margaret's harassment and overreach that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse of power. But the most interesting conversation happened at my last stop, the house directly next to Margaret's, where Bob, Margaret's boyfriend, lived. Bob answered the door, looking exhausted and defeated, like he'd been through some kind of emotional marathon. "Oh," he said when he saw me. "Hi." "Hey, Bob. I wanted to invite you to my community appreciation party next Saturday." Bob glanced nervously toward Margaret's house, then stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him. "Look," he said in a quiet voice, "I need to tell you something. Margaret's not. She's not well. This HOA thing has become an obsession with her. She stays up all night researching legal strategies. She's spending thousands of dollars on lawyers and consultants. And she's convinced that you're part of some kind of conspiracy to undermine her authority." The revelation hit me like a cold slap. I'd been treating Margaret as a petty tyrant drunk on power. But what Bob was describing sounded like something much more serious. "Bob, do you think she needs help?" "I think she needs professional help, but she won't listen to me. She thinks I'm either completely supportive of her crusade or I'm betraying her. There's no middle ground anymore." Bob looked around nervously, then continued. "She's planning something big for your party. I don't know all the details, but she's been talking about final solutions and decisive action. She's convinced that if she can stop your party and get you to back down, everyone else will fall in line." What kind of decisive action? I honestly don't know. But she's been meeting with people I don't recognize, spending money she doesn't have, and making promises about what's going to happen to anyone who opposes her. A chill ran down my spine. Margaret's escalation pattern had been troubling enough when I thought it was just about power and control. But if Bob was right, if she'd crossed into the territory of genuine delusion and obsession, then my party might trigger something much more dangerous than a legal battle. "Bob, are you safe?" The smell of charred wood still lingered in my backyard when Margaret Henderson marched across my property line at 7:23 a.m., clutching a clipboard like a weapon and wearing the kind of smile that promises nothing but trouble. She had no idea that her petty little campaign against my weekend campfires would end with a 1,000-person rock concert, professional pyrotechnics, and her own HOA rules being used as kindling for the biggest bonfire our neighborhood had ever seen. The inciting incident. It all started 3 months earlier, on a perfect September evening. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that makes you want to gather around something warm, so I'd built a modest campfire in my backyard fire pit, the same one I'd been using every weekend for 2 years without a single complaint. The flames danced about 3 feet high, casting orange shadows across my fence while I roasted marshmallows with my 8-year-old nephew, Tommy. The crackling logs filled the silence between Tommy's excited chatter about school and my own peaceful thoughts about finally having a stress-free weekend. That's when I heard the sharp click-clack of high heels on concrete, cutting through the evening calm like nails on a chalkboard. Margaret Henderson appeared at my back gate, her silver hair pulled into what I can only describe as an aggressive bun, wearing a pristine white blazer that somehow managed to look both expensive and completely impractical for a Saturday evening neighborhood stroll. She clutched a leather portfolio against her chest and had the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who just discovered gum on her shoe. "Excuse me," she called out in that sing-song voice that immediately puts you on guard. "I'm Margaret Henderson, the new HOA president. We need to discuss your fire situation." I glanced at Tommy, who was mid-bite into a perfectly golden marshmallow, then back at Margaret. "Fire situation? You mean my campfire?" "Yes, your unauthorized open flame." She flipped through her portfolio with theatrical precision. According to Section 15.3 of our updated HOA guidelines, all outdoor fires require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which I now chair. The audacity hit me like a slap. I'd lived in Willowbrook Estates for 8 years, long before Margaret had moved into the house directly behind mine. My fire pit was clearly visible when she'd toured the neighborhood, and she'd never once mentioned it during the 6 months she'd been living here. "Margaret, I've been having campfires here for years. Previous HOA boards never had an issue with it." Her smile tightened into something that barely qualified as friendly. "Well, things change when proper leadership takes charge. I've received numerous complaints about smoke, sparks, and safety hazards. This neighborhood has families, children who could be endangered by your recreational burning." I looked at Tommy again, who was now holding his marshmallow stick like a tiny sword, completely oblivious to the fact that he was apparently in mortal danger from our campfire that was contained in a commercial fire pit, surrounded by cleared space, with a garden hose within arm's reach. "Who complained?" I asked. "That's confidential." Margaret's voice carried that particular brand of smug satisfaction that people get when they hold a tiny amount of power over someone else. "But I can tell you it's more than one concerned neighbor." The thing about Margaret Henderson was that she'd moved to our quiet cul-de-sac from a much more expensive neighborhood across town, and she'd made it clear from day one that she thought Willowbrook Estates had potential that was currently being wasted. She'd run for HOA president on a platform of elevating our community standards and had won by exactly 3 votes in an election where only 12 people bothered to show up. "Look," I said, keeping my voice level, "I follow all fire safety protocols. The pit is proper distance from structures, I keep water nearby, and I never leave it unattended." "What exactly is the problem?" Margaret's eyes gleamed with the kind of enthusiasm that makes normal people take a step backward. "The problem is that we're trying to maintain a certain level of sophistication in this neighborhood. Campfires are rustic, They lower property values and send the wrong message to potential buyers. That's when I realized this wasn't about safety, complaints, or even HOA rules. This was about Margaret's vision of turning our modest, middle-class neighborhood into some kind of sterile showcase community where nobody actually lived, they just existed to maintain appearances. "I'm not shutting down my fire pit," I said finally. "If you want to change the rules, call a proper HOA meeting with a required notice and let the homeowners vote on it." Margaret's fake smile finally cracked, revealing something much colder underneath. "Oh, but you see, the rules have already been changed. The Architectural Review Committee, that's me, voted unanimously to ban all open flames without prior approval. And I'm afraid your application has been denied." She pulled out an official-looking document and handed it to me with the kind of flourish you'd expect from someone serving divorce papers. The letterhead read, "Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," and the text, in legal-sized font, informed me that effective immediately, my unauthorized fire pit usage was in violation of community standards and must cease within 48 hours or face fines starting at $200 per incident. "You voted unanimously?" I asked, scanning the document. "Who else is on this committee?" "Well, as of last week's emergency reorganization meeting, the Architectural Review Committee consists of myself as chair. Sometimes, one-person committees are the most efficient way to handle these matters." The sheer audacity of it left me speechless for a moment. She'd essentially created a new rule, appointed herself as the sole authority to enforce it, and was now using that made-up power to shut down something I'd been doing legally for years. But what really got under my skin wasn't the overreach, it was the smug certainty in her voice that I would just roll over and comply. Margaret had clearly pegged me as someone who would grumble privately but ultimately cave to authority, no matter how arbitrarily that authority had been constructed. She was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. But first, I had to find out exactly what I was dealing with and whether her new rules were even legally enforceable. First escalation, the research phase. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop, diving deep into HOA law and our community's original governing documents. What I found made my blood boil. According to our CC and ours, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that actually govern the neighborhood, any changes to community rules required a 30-day notice to all homeowners, followed by a vote at a general meeting with at least a 60% quorum. Margaret's emergency reorganization meeting had been attended by exactly 4 people: herself, her next-door neighbor Bob, who she'd been dating since her divorce finalized, the treasurer who was afraid of confrontation, and one other homeowner who'd apparently just wandered in looking for the community center. More importantly, the original HOA documents specifically protected reasonable recreational use of private property and included language about fire pits, grills, and outdoor cooking equipment being permitted as long as they met basic safety standards. Margaret hadn't just bent the rules, she'd completely ignored them and hoped nobody would bother to check. I printed out the relevant sections, highlighted the key passages, and walked over to Bob Martinez's house. Bob was our longest-serving HOA member and the closest thing we had to an institutional memory of how things were supposed to work. Bob answered the door in his weekend uniform of faded jeans and a coffee-stained t-shirt, took one look at my papers, and immediately invited me in for what he called the real story. "That woman," he said, settling into his recliner with a heavy sigh, "has been calling me twice a day since she took over, demanding I change the locks on the community center, update the website to reflect her vision, and authorize expenditures for things like professional landscaping consultants and community enhancement projects." "What kind of enhancement projects?" Bob pulled out his own folder apparently. I wasn't the only one documenting Margaret's overreach. "She wants to install a guard gate, hire a management company, mandate specific paint colors for all houses, and establish quiet hours from 7 p.m. to 8 a.m. She's also proposed banning children's playground equipment in front yards because it's unsightly and requiring all dogs to be smaller than 25 pounds. The scope of Margaret's ambitions was staggering. She wasn't just coming after my fire pit, she was planning a complete transformation of our neighborhood into her personal vision of suburban perfection. Bob, can she actually do any of this? Not legally, no. But she can make life miserable for anyone who opposes her, and she's counting on people being too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to fight back. We spent the next hour going through every document, every precedent, and every legal avenue available. The picture that emerged was clear. Margaret was operating completely outside her authority, but she'd positioned herself cleverly. As HOA president, she could call meetings, send official-looking letters, and create the appearance of legitimate authority. Most people would see the letterhead and the formal language and assume she had the right to make these demands. Bob agreed to help me organize a proper challenge to her authority, but he warned me about something that made my stomach drop. "She's not just going after you," he said, walking me to the door. "Yesterday she sent violation notices to the Johnsons for their vegetable garden, the Patels for their wind chimes, and 3 different families for excessive vehicle storage, which means having more than 2 cars in their own driveways." I walked home with a growing sense of dread, but also a crystallizing determination. Margaret wasn't just targeting me, she was waging war against the entire character of our neighborhood. The question was whether I'd be fighting this battle alone, or if other homeowners would stand up to her reign of petty tyranny. That afternoon, I decided to test the waters by doing exactly what I'd been doing every weekend for 2 years. I built a campfire. But this time, Margaret was ready for me. Second escalation, the code enforcement gambit. I'd barely gotten the kindling lit when I heard the rumble of a diesel engine pulling into my driveway. Through my front window, I watched a white pickup truck with city code enforcement painted on the side park behind my car, effectively blocking me in. Margaret appeared from her backyard, walking quickly across the grass with her phone pressed to her ear. She was nodding enthusiastically and pointing toward my house with the kind of theatrical gestures that suggested she was providing commentary for someone's benefit. The code enforcement officer who approached my front door was a tired-looking man in his 50s with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and the expression of someone who'd rather be doing literally anything else with his Saturday afternoon. "Mr. Johnson? I'm Officer Rick Valdez with City Code Enforcement. We received a complaint about an illegal fire in your backyard." "It's not illegal," I said, leading him around to the fire pit. "It meets all city fire codes. It's the proper distance from structures, and I have a permit for the installation." Officer Valdez examined my setup with the thoroughness of someone who clearly knew what he was looking at. He measured distances, checked the fire pit specifications, and even tested my garden hose to make sure it had adequate water pressure. "Everything looks fine to me," he said finally. "This is a legal installation with proper safety clearances." "Who made the complaint?" Before I could answer, Margaret materialized beside us, as if she'd been waiting in the wings for her cue. "Officer, I'm Margaret Henderson, HOA president. This resident has been repeatedly warned that open fires violate our community standards. When he refused to comply with our Architectural Review Board's decision, I had no choice but to involve city authorities." Officer Valdez looked back and forth between us, and I could see him trying to figure out how he'd gotten dragged into what was clearly an HOA dispute masquerading as a code violation. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override city ordinances. This fire pit is legal under city code, properly installed, and safely maintained. There's nothing for me to cite here." Margaret's composure cracked just slightly. "But surely the city has an interest in supporting community standards and property values?" "Ma'am, the city has an interest in public safety. This setup meets all safety requirements. If you have an HOA dispute, you'll need to resolve that through your own governance procedures. After Officer Valdez left, Margaret lingered in my backyard with the determined look of someone who wasn't nearly finished fighting. "You think you're very clever," she said, calling in favors and manipulating the system. "I didn't call anyone, Margaret." "You did. And you wasted a city employee's Saturday afternoon because you don't understand the difference between legal authority and personal preference." "Oh, I understand authority perfectly well." Her voice dropped into a register I hadn't heard before, colder, more calculated. "And I understand that there are many ways to make life difficult for residents who choose not to cooperate with community leadership." She walked away without explaining what that meant, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from my campfire. Over the next week, I found out exactly what Margaret meant by making life difficult. First, I received a notice that my trash cans were improperly positioned and needed to be moved 6 inches further from the curb. Then came a citation for excessive noise during what Margaret claimed were quiet hours, apparently. My lawnmower at 10 a.m. on a Saturday violated a rule she'd invented about weekend maintenance activities. But the real escalation came when I arrived home from work on Thursday to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door, informing me that my house was scheduled for an emergency architectural compliance inspection the following morning at 8 a.m. The notice was signed by Margaret in her capacity as Architectural Review Board Chair and demanded access to my property for a comprehensive evaluation of potential code violations and community standard infractions. I called Bob immediately. "She can't do that," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I mean, I don't think she can do that. But I've never seen anything like this before." Neither had I. But Margaret was clearly escalating her campaign, and I realized that my quiet resistance strategy of simply following the actual rules wasn't going to be enough. She was playing a different game, one where she made up the rules as she went along and bet that I wouldn't have the energy, knowledge, or resources to fight back effectively. What Margaret didn't know was that her aggressive tactics had just given me the perfect opening to turn this entire conflict on its head. But first, I needed to survive her inspection and find out exactly how far she was willing to push her fake authority. The answer, as I'd discover the next morning, was much further than I'd imagined. Third escalation, the inspection ambush. Margaret arrived at my house at precisely 8 a.m. Friday morning, but she didn't come alone. Behind her were 2 people I didn't recognize, a stern-looking woman in a business suit carrying a professional camera, and a younger man with a tablet who was typing notes as they walked up my driveway. "Mr. Johnson," Margaret called out in the overly cheerful voice she used when she was about to deliver particularly bad news, "I'd like you to meet Jennifer Walsh from Walsh Property Consulting and David Kim, our new HOA enforcement specialist." I opened my front door, but didn't step aside to let them in. I don't recall agreeing to any inspection, and I certainly didn't agree to having strangers photograph my property. Margaret's smile tightened. According to Section 12.7 of our updated community guidelines, homeowners are required to provide reasonable access for architectural compliance reviews. Failure to cooperate constitutes a violation subject to immediate fines and potential legal action. She handed me another official-looking document, this one informing me that my refusal to allow the inspection would result in a $500 fine, followed by additional daily penalties until I complied. And if I still refuse, then we'll be forced to place a lion on your property and potentially pursue foreclosure proceedings to recover unpaid fines and legal costs. The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret wasn't just threatening inconvenience or embarrassment anymore. She was threatening my house, my home, the place where I'd lived for 8 years and built a life. But something about the way she delivered the threat felt theatrical, like she was performing for the benefit of her hired consultants rather than communicating with me. And the more I looked at Jennifer Walsh and David Kim, the more they seemed like props in an elaborate performance rather than legitimate professionals. Fine, I said, but I want to see credentials from both of your consultants, and I want copies of whatever documentation you're going to be creating during this inspection.